As a student, I am all too familiar with the phrase, "there are no stupid questions." For students, this is a comforting idea at first. It's nice to know that you can pop your hand up at any time and blurt out any number of ponderings without worrying about the professor judging you. I have also quickly learned that while a professor may welcome everyone to ask any question, other students are usually not as welcoming. Countless times I have sat in class amazed at the stupidity of another student's question. Let's be honest, we have all come to the conclusion that while it's great of teachers to let their students know that they welcome all questions, there are some questions that are just kind of stupid. Sometimes you might ask a question before you get the thought fully formulated in your head, and so it comes out sounding stupid. Or maybe you ask a question and the answer is apparent. It's written on the board, or it's already been said 100 times. Or maybe, like the disciples, you ask the wrong question. For example, if you're in math class and ask who's to blame for fractions, I would consider that a stupid question. Not because the person asking it is stupid, they might be very smart, but because it's simply the wrong question. And that's exactly why Jesus got frustrated with his apostles. Just as no one is to blame for fractions, no one is to blame for this man's blindness or any other uncontrollable thing that might happen to us. Fractions just are. They're numbers or parts of numbers. The question is, what are we going to do with fractions? What are we going to do with the fact of blindness or with those who are blind? How are we going to help? After Hurricane Katrina, I remember there was a small group of people who claimed that the death and destruction caused by natural forces was God's punishment on a sinful city. I'm sure the same group of people is making similar claims about the recent events in Japan. They also claim that AIDS is a punishment to the human race, specifically to those who identify as gay. And all of these natural disasters will continue to happen because Christians are allowing sin in the world. Now, if we look at natural disasters the same way Jesus sees this man's natural blindness, I think it's easy to see how wrong these people are. Hurricane Katrina was no more anyone's fault than anyone is to blame for fractions, or earthquakes, or blindness from birth, or any other way people are born. I heard a story once by a man whose son was physically and mentally impaired. One day, the man and his son were walking by a park where boys were playing baseball, and the man's son asked if he thought they would let him play. Not expecting that they would, the man went over and asked one of the boys anyway. The boy said they were behind by a lot, but they could let him bat in the 9th inning. The man's son was ecstatic just to be able to sit on the bench. By the 9th inning, the team had scored a few more runs, and they were only 2 down. There were 2 outs, the bases were loaded, and the man's son was up to bat. He slowly made his way to the plate and struggled to hold the bat correctly. Everyone on both teams looked around in silence, wondering what they should do. Suddenly, the pitcher from the other team started walking toward the boy. About halfway to home plate, he softly lobbed the ball towards the man's son. On the 3rd pitch, he finally made contact, and a slow grounder rolled towards the pitcher. But rather than quickly throwing it to first base, ending the game, winning it for them, he threw it high and wide over the first baseman. The other players of the team caught on, and overcome with excitement, the boy slowly started to make his way around the bases and made the scoring point for the team while both of the teams wildly cheered him to home. The man ended his story by saying everything God creates is supposed to be perfect, but his son could barely walk and couldn't learn like other people. He said the world could not see God's perfection in this boy. But this day in the park showed him that his son is made perfect in the way other people treat him. Rather than asking who was to blame for his son's condition, the man simply asked those boys if he could play ball. Rather than asking who is to blame for this man's blindness, the disciples should have been asking who is to blame for this man needing to beg. Why isn't the fullness and perfection of God being shown through how the outcasts of our world are treated? I say it's because we're asking the wrong questions. Why can't that homeless guy get a job already? Why don't you just quit drinking? Why wouldn't you just leave him if he's hitting you? These are the wrong questions. One, because they are heavy with judgments. And two, because to ask these types of questions, a lot has to be assumed by the person asking them. When the disciples asked who was to blame for the man's blindness, they were assuming that blindness was a punishment for this man, and that God punishes sins with physical limitations, and that there were sins committed in the first place that deserved this punishment, and that somehow this man's blindness could have been avoided, or it was a rightful ailment. The Pharisees were so sure of their assumptions that they could not even believe the facts. This man Jesus had been causing trouble for them for some time now. He went against everything they were so sure about when it came to God and faith. They could not believe this man had really been born blind because Jesus had done the work of healing him on the Sabbath, which was strictly forbidden by God, and any man who breaks the rules of God simply cannot have the power to heal blindness. The Pharisees were so disturbed because they were so sure of what they knew to be true. They were so unable to see past their strictness that they began to become belligerent. They questioned the man, interrogated his parents, went back to bullying the man again. They could never be satisfied because the facts as we know them could not be possible in their world. They asked so many questions and got straightforward answers, but they were never satisfied because they were asking the wrong questions. And so we might ask, why were they asking the wrong questions? I say, because they were too sure in what they knew or what they assumed. They assumed they knew God's will and rules. And even if they did know God's rule, they assumed they knew who and how God forgives. They were just a little too sure about their faith. Faith is faith. It's not being precisely sure about every detail, because when you're that sure, it's no longer faith. There has to be some mystery involved. Faith trusts that everything will work out for the best, but it doesn't know why or how or even what the best looks like. Faith takes some faith, and digging up or creating certainties about exactly what faith has to look like is no longer faith. The Pharisees became blinded by their sureness. Faith just can't be too sure, because when it is, it becomes oppressive, judgmental, and worst of all, it takes power away from God. How can we know God's will for others? How can we claim to be able to rightly judge other humans? I have a bumper sticker on my car. You may have seen it. It says, "We're all wrong." Now, I've had to defend this statement many times, but I stick to it. We aren't all wrong in that our faith is incorrect. We are wrong in thinking we know it all. Many people have gotten a lot right, but we're all a little wrong if we think we've got it all right. Now, consider the man who was blind from birth. He asked very few questions. One I may have asked is, "Who are you and why are you rubbing mud on my eyes?" But no, he was a man who was faithfully obeying Jesus. And then once he could see, he tells the Pharisees who are badgering him, "I don't know how he did it, but I was blind and now I see." He's embracing the mystery that the Pharisees can't even wrap their minds around. And then, when Jesus tells him he's the Messiah, he doesn't ask him to prove it. He doesn't ask any questions, actually. He simply bows down and worships him. Every time I read this story in John, I always think about the book, A Ring of Endless Light, by Madeleine L'Engle. It's a coming-of-age novel that tells the story of Vicky, a teenage girl whose family is spending the summer with her grandfather because his health is quickly declining. Vicky and her little brother are talking just a few hours after their grandfather was rushed to the hospital. They both know their grandfather is going to die, and her little brother Rob starts asking her questions. In the book, he says, "Vicky, there are probably lots of planets besides us with people on them, don't you think? So maybe there's a planet somewhere where nobody has any eyes. Well, if nobody had any eyes, they'd all get along all right without them, wouldn't they? They'd compensate. And if someone from our planet went to the planet where no one had eyes and tried to describe something to them, the way the rain looks falling on the ocean, or the lighthouse beam at night, or a sunrise, it couldn't be done, could it? Well, maybe when the people on the planet with no eyes die, then maybe they get sent to planets where there are eyes. But you couldn't tell them about it ahead of time. So maybe when we die, we'll get something as important as sight. But because we don't know what it is, nobody could tell us about it now any more than we could tell about sight to the people on the planet with no eyes." This is why Jesus tells the Pharisees they are blind. When we think we know, when we think we've got it all figured out and it fits into our nice little religion box, then Jesus says that's when we really have no idea. That is when we are most ignorant about who God really is. As soon as we start asking the right questions, free of judgment and assumptions, and start embracing some mystery, we will be able to experience a great fullness and understanding of God. Be secure in your faith and know that faith means trusting in the things we cannot know or see. Instead of looking for blame, let us look for what God can do for us and through us. May we all let the light of Christ shine into our hearts so that we might finally be able to see. Amen.
Amen. Well done.